Folks, welcome to the launch of this report today. It's an extremely important report. It was commissioned by the Custody Network, and it looks at the period of prison turmoil in Armagh Women's Prison and in the H-Blocks of Long Kesh. Prison struggle historically in Ireland is nothing new. What you may find when you look at this report, when you read this report, is the volume and the pre-planning that went in to how this prison struggle was instigated by the British government, organised by the prison authorities and carried out with extreme brutality. I have a panel in front of me today of those who are either professionals in their field or who have first-hand experience of the conditions that prevail within those two prisons. I want to begin with the introduction of the panel, so can you tell me who you are for our viewers?
My name is Síle Darragh. I'm from the Short Strand, Ballinmacarrt in East Belfast. I'm an ex-political prisoner. I was sentenced to and served 5 years in Armagh Women's Jail.
Pádraig Ó Muirigh, solicitor to the inquiry. I was involved in gathering and presenting evidence to the independent panel.
Séanna Walsh, former IRA prisoner, political activist.
I'm Joe Scraton, Emeritus Professor in the School of Law at Queen's University, and I'm editor of the report.
Joining us today by Zoom is Dr. John Burton, who is a medical professional. John, what is your take on the conditions that prevailed and the medical implication of those conditions inside the prisons of Armagh and the H-Blocks of Long Kesh?
The cumulative effects of the prisoners' experience, men and women, is quite outside my experience, as these could not have happened without a planned approach. One of the particular incidents I was quite concerned with was the persistent allegations of collusion between the medical doctors in the prison service and the prison officers. For example, if a prisoner was brought before a doctor, the medical officer, the medical doctor on the wing, he made an allegation of ill treatment, not infrequently the officer who had inflicted the abuse was standing behind him. But what was even more concerning was that these allegations were almost always dismissed by the doctor. And on top of that, because these were deemed to be malicious allegations, they were the prisoner was further punished and got loss of remission. So it was understandable that the prisoners were very loath to engage with the medical services, because to them, and when listening to the evidence given to us, there appeared to be a very strong collusion between the medical officers, the medical doctors, and the prison officers, and indeed right higher up to the prison governors. I must say, when participating in this evidence, I felt indeed a sense of shame, my own personal shame, that during this time in the 1970s and early 80s, I was living in a general practice setting in the Mid-Ulster area. It was a predominantly unionist, loyalist area, and the narrative at that was that these prisoners deserved what they got. They asked for it. And I must admit some sense of shame that I did not object strongly or more strongly to that assertion. And it is only now that I can say that those prisoners, there was no prisoner or ex-prisoner whom we listened to, there was none who wanted to be treated in that way. There was none who wanted to be in prison. There was none who wanted to be on the no wash protest. There was none who wanted to be on the blanket protest. There was none who wanted to be in confinement. There was none who wanted to be beaten over the heads with heavy books. And worse, these prisoners, when speaking to them, they did not wish this on themselves. And what became clear as we listened to more and more evidence was the systematic structure of torture and inhuman and degrading behavior. This was designed to smash a political process within the prison, but also outside it. This was a political mechanism inflicted on the prisoners, many of them who had been sent to prison on spurious evidence, which was often manufactured and in front of a single judge on the diplock courts. So the more I listened to them, the more convinced I was that this was systematic and systemic. And then I came to the simple realization that the government of the day was the government I paid taxes to. The UK government, the United Kingdom government was the government I paid taxes to. And they were doing this in my name. I find that deeply upsetting when I look back in hindsight. But, you know, I have to admit that I should have been more strenuous in my opposition at the time.
Can I begin, Séanna, with you? And can you give us some of the background why this report was deemed to be necessary and how you set about collating the information that's contained within it?
Well, I suppose that the main thing to say, first of all, is the fact that we have succeeded in producing this report. It has taken a long time. It's 39 years since the blanket protest ended. And in that period, there have been a lot of reports, a lot of books, a lot of films made about the circumstances within the prisons at the time, particularly in and around the period of the hunger strikes. But what we believed was necessary was that the background to the circumstances of the hunger strike were brought to the fore. And we felt that Armagh Women's Prison was a central part of this whole report and the process which led to the report. But we felt that the circumstances of the actual prison protests had to be collected, collated, and brought together and to really show the nature of the system that attempted to break Republican resistance to British involvement in this part of Ireland.
I want to bring Síle Darragh to this at this stage because I think it's clear that, again, just to emphasise the point that you make, while the H-Blocks and the conditions that prevailed in the H-Blocks are well known, probably what isn't as well known is almost the planning of a confrontation with the small number of women prisoners who were held in Armagh at that time. Síle, so what is your experience of that period?
I know that sometimes there's a lot of criticism about it, but that the focus was on the H-Blocks, but you have to understand that there were 400 odd men on protest in the H-Blocks, and at our highest point there were 40 women on the protest in Armagh. The consistent number was 32. Armagh is an old Victorian prison. It's easily brought under control. It still had the wing system. And while we were on a no work protest, the women in Armagh, we still had our own clothes. We weren't on a no wash protest because the circumstances weren't the same as the men. They were kept locked up in cells. And when they got out to slop out, the chamber pots were being kicked around them, they were being beaten. We didn't have those circumstances until there was a new governor brought into Armagh in late 1979. So in February 1980, and it was notorious that the food was very bad in Armagh. So on the 7th of February 1980, we would have been unlocked to go down to a hot plate at the front of the wing to collect food. And somebody shouted up that it was chicken and chips, which was a great rarity for us. So obviously everybody wanted a decent meal. And that even in itself, and it shows you the mentality that went behind even doing that, was to entice the women down to have them in the one spot at the front of the wing. We were on B wing at the time. And when the majority of us were at this hot plate to collect meals, there's a connecting door between A and B wings, and that door opened, and 30 to 40 male screws, all dressed in navy uniforms, formed a semicircle blocking off the stairs back to the rest of the wing. And then effectively the governor came out, he announced that there was going to be a wing search, that we were going to be locked into these two big, larger cells, and that all the cells would be searched. And he turned on his heel then and went into what was known as the class office, where the prison officers would stay. And some women started to move towards the stairs to go to their cells, and the male prison officers attacked. And I have to say, considering that we had, as I said, the food was very bad, medical treatment wasn't good. Most times if you asked, if you complained about any sort of, say a headache or stomach pain or anything, it was a prison officer dressed in a white coat that came to administer the medical stuff that came out. So it wasn't that we were getting a nurse under the wing or a doctor under the wing. So a lot of the women at that stage were they'd lost a lot of weight. There wasn't a lot of exercise, so muscle tone wouldn't have been good. And you have to understand that the majority of the women, when they went into Armagh, were aged between 17 and 21. So these were young women being attacked by men in their 30s, 40s, and even into their 50s. And I mean attacked, I mean physical attacks. One woman, I actually seen her being physically picked up and thrown up the wing and landing on her head. But after a while, it was Mairead Farrell was the OC at the time, and myself, we realised that because nobody from the prison authorities was going to stop it, nobody was going to bring it under control. So we then attempted to bring it under control, and we're pulling the women off the men who were beating them. And we finally got it under control and got people to go into these two cells. There was a lot of noise for quite a few hours, and then after a while we were taken one by one out of the cells. In front of these male prison officers, we were physically searched by a female prison officer, put back into our cells, and found that they'd just been completely wrecked. So that was us locked up then, effectively, for the day. And when we kept telling people, request medical assistance, request to get out to the toilet. So they were pressing the buzzer in the cell, but that was all just being ignored, and the male prison officers were still on the wing. The following day, we were finally told, my door was opened and I was told to exercise in the yard. So I came out, because we'd been locked up from the night before, and I turned right. Now, the bathrooms in Armagh were just a cell converted. There was a bath and there was a toilet and wash hand basins put into this cell. And they still had the cell door. So when I turned right to go to the bathrooms, I was informed, you're not out to go to the bathroom, you're out to go for exercise. But as I moved on, a couple of male prison officers tried to grab me, and one of the females said, no, look, we've no instruction, just let it go for the minute. So I came out of the bathroom, I was accompanied the whole way from B3, the whole way down the stairs, the whole way out to the yard by male prison officers. I got out and there was two women already in the yard. And I shouted up to Mairead Farrell to say that what was happening, and then another woman came out behind me, she'd been unlocked next, and she said to me, Sheila, they've locked the bathrooms. So after I had went to the bathroom, they then went with the same keys that they lock our cells with and locked the bathroom doors. So when people think about the protest in Armagh and they think about the No Wash protest, we didn't choose to go on to a No Wash protest. We were on a No Wash.
Physically, you were prevented from using
Yes, we were prevented from using the bathrooms.
I want to return just to those conditions and how they were exercised as opposed to how they were authorised But I want to bring Pádraig in, and I said in my introduction that there's a long history of prison brutality towards Republican prisoners over many hundreds of years. But having read the report, and I know you were instrumental in getting the report compiled, do you see that there's a similarity into how these events unfolded?
The abuses, the human rights abuses, were not random. They're linked to deeper pathologies of power. And I think one of the resounding findings is the political interference, political motivation in prison policy. And I think that's something that Phil and the panel picked up on. I think it's the most important finding of it. So for me, that was the most resounding. I mean, obviously it's well documented, the other physical abuses, but what wasn't in the public domain was the role of the NIO, the role of the state, and how some prison governors were very uncomfortable with that development, and how they predicted that this would lead eventually to the hunger strikes, it would lead to deaths.
Maybe if you could just explain that. So are you saying that the NIO had already predicted, once they embarked in this direction, that it would lead to a hunger strike?
Yes, I mean, the key part of this report is that it's evidence-based. So the panel heard evidence from former prison governors, and one of those governors gave very strong testimony that the NIO were increasingly getting involved in governors' decisions. And that was very politically motivated, and that was an attempt, as he put it, to break prisoners. So that came through in that. We also heard evidence from documents, or we gathered documents from Kew Gardens, documents which were released under the 30-year rule, and they supported what the governor had told the panel as well. So it's very, very clear that there was political motivation to the direction of the prison policy. And that led to deterioration in the situation. And as I remarked earlier, that was entirely predictable. And because it was predictable, it was also preventable. So I think that's one of the most important aspects of the report, were those findings in terms of the political aspects to it, but also that it was entirely avoidable. And I think one of the lessons from this report is that there should not be a recurrence of situations like this. We need to learn from this. We need to learn from this evidence-based report, which has put out very, very clear findings, and they're now obviously in the public domain. So it's important in those people who are involved in prison policy that they read this report, that we learn from this report, and that we prevent the recurrence of situations like this again in the future.
I want to bring Phil in, who, for anyone that doesn't know him, and that's very few, I have to say, you've spent a lifetime in prison reform and trying to, as best you can, humanise prisons, I suppose, or abolish them. Maybe it's a better idea. In compiling, and you edited the report, and I know that you have a keen interest in prison conditions wherever they prevail and around all prisoners. Was there any surprises?
I think to put it into context, I mean, this is my fifth major piece of work on prisons, ranging from the prison protests in Scottish prisons, right the way through to Strange Ways in Manchester, and so on. So I've sat on panels and I've written reports before. I think what really concerned me was the point that Pádraig was making. 1975, 29th of December, and I want to quote from this because it's really important. The Director of Prisons for Operations, W.I. Davis, he wrote a document, Contingency Plans to Accommodate Changes in the Prison Population and to deal with prisoner reaction to those changes and subsequent relocations. This was a secret document, it was marked secret, and we accessed this at Kew Gardens. And this is one of the points that it makes, that the administration will withstand this pressure, that is the pressure of the prisoners to force government to change, even after the deaths of prisoners. This is 1975. And he goes on to say, having seen what an administrative and disciplinary disaster this has proved to be, he's talking about the whole issue of having special category status here. We should be resolute in our intention not to weaken in our decisions. It is anticipated that these measures will produce strong reaction from the prisoners, and mass and individual hunger strikes may be expected. And he goes on to say up to and including death. Now this is before the strikes. It was completely anticipated. That was passed higher up the chain to the British government. In other words, when the hunger strikes eventually started, following on from the blanket protests, that whole sequence of events had been predicted by the government and its agents. So there was never a moment during that period in time that the progression of what was happening hadn't been anticipated. One of the other documents from Kew Gardens, which is really important, is a document that comes from the Deputy Health Chief in the north of Ireland. And in that document, he states categorically that those who were actually on the blanket protests were not only in good health, but some of them were gaining weight. So the question you then ask is, this is being fed from the prisons through the NIO to the British government. So initially the Labour government, then the Conservative government are receiving information that these are not really serious protests. And then you contrast that with the real evidence of what happened eventually in Armagh and initially in the H-Blocks. The levels of brutality. Now, the thing about a piece of work like this is that when you read the scope of material, the range of material coming from individuals years down the line who went through this whole process, what is striking is the same names come up. We don't name the names in here, but the same names in terms of prison officers, prison governors, doctors, those names keep coming up. The same issues arise, even though they are individual people speaking on their own account. In other words, this isn't like a group of guys or women who have got together and said, we've got to get a story right. These are people being interviewed independently of each other. And the same stories, the same names, the same levels of brutality. And I've got to be clear about this. I mean, I have worked on a lot of material in terms of the damage that prison can do to people and the brutality in some prisons, not just here. There were times when I was reading the accounts that I had to stop, because although I knew it and I understood it, from the interviews, those interviews that were given, they took your breath away. That it was knowing the threats, the intimidation. There is one point where, excuse me, where it said, you know, what we're going to do now, basically the phrase that was used was the gloves are off. And this was actually being managed on the wings. So whether or not those in Westminster knew the detail of that, because obviously they didn't go on the wings, they were relying on the Northern Ireland office to feed back to them. Whether they knew the detail of that, I don't know. But for years, year on year, the level of brutality was routine, it was systemic, it was incredibly painful, it was certainly inhuman and degrading, and on occasions, there is no question, under any international definition, it amounted to torture. On occasions, not the whole process. So, you know, the power of the report isn't in the editing or the writing. You know, I'm there to compile it, I'm there to pull it together. The power of the report is in the evidence. And the evidence is twofold. It comes from the one hand, from the documents, and we have a mass of documents, not all of them, because some of them won't exist anymore. And the other part of the evidence is from the women and men who suffered those deprivations.
I want to bring Síanna back in again, just briefly, because for those who are perhaps not familiar with what we're trying to explain happened in those horrible years and the loss of life that happened, both as a result of the activity in the prison and as a result of the conflict created with the prison authorities and with Republicans outside the prison. It may be worthwhile that we contrast this regime strategy to what came before it. So, in other words, what was the, prison's prison, and it's a horrible place, and it's meant to be a horrible place. And I'm not defending that, it's a fact. What was that relationship prior to this change of policy that Phil has outlined?
Well, I suppose in 1972, June 1972, there was a hunger strike by Republican prisoners in Crumlin Road Jail and in Armagh Women's Prison for what we call political status, but which the authorities eventually conceded to, which was special category status. That's the name that they gave it. And it meant then that basically Republican prisoners, and also, it has to be said, Loyalist prisoners, were treated as prisoners of war, prisoners of the conflict, and they were basically afforded the same, freedoms, if you will, within the jail system that you would see on television of prisoner of war camps, whereby we organised our own day, we organised our own education, our own sports, our own handicrafts, whatever, our own escapes, of course. And we basically prepared ourselves for our release back into the struggle as far as Republican activists were concerned. Now, the conditions that we were held under, they were, similar to the prisoner of war camp that you will see on the television, with the Nissen huts, the watchtowers, the barbed wire fences, the military patrols, the machine gun posts with the searchlights, all of that paraphernalia. Those were the conditions in Long Kesh. And whenever the British decided to do away with political status or special cat, whatever you want to call it, we had to understand the context of all of that, Joe. And for us, what we were trying to, get our heads around, why are they creating a crisis within the prisons which will spill onto the streets outside? And, there was the relationship that we would have had when we had political status with the prison authorities. They played no part in our lives, it has to be said, but it wasn't one of continual acrimony or, tension. And I just want to make a point here, because it took us a while to figure out why they did this. And for me, the way that I sort of got my head around it was that if the British have political prisoners in Ireland, it means they have a political problem in Ireland. If you have a political problem, you have to solve it through politics. So the British tried to change the context and say that what they had was a law and order problem. So you don't have to fix it through politics. You just, you do away with these political prisoners, and then you employ more stringent laws. You introduce shoot to kill. You pull the British Army off the front line and replace them with police and the RUC and all of that. So all of that was the context in which we found ourselves on the protests in the blocks and in Armagh.
I want you, if you can, because you paint a picture of a Second World War type prisoner of war camp with watchtowers and all the things. Ultimately, the authorities are still in control. They're in the watchtowers. Prisoners are on the ground. And with the best will in the world, which probably didn't exist, but if there was the best will in the world, there had to be occasional confrontation or arguments between prison administration and the prisoners. Yeah. So in the event of that, was there a mechanism that could resolve that to, I suppose, nearly everyone's satisfaction?
Well, we had our own command structure, and so you had the OC of the cage or the OC of the camp would meet with the prison administration on a regular basis to try and preempt any of the sort of problems that you would encounter within the running of the jail. But also we took it a step further than that, Joe, because in the cages of Long Cash, when we had status, we formed what was called the Jail Council, whereby the leaders of the IRA Republican prisoners would have met with the officials and with the loyalist leadership within the jail to iron out any of the issues and problems that we would encounter on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
So is it fair to say, and I want to bring Síle in about Armagh, and then we'll bring Pádraig back, and again, he's been very patient. Is it fair to say then that the prison life went from peaceful coexistence to out-and-out confrontation, life and death confrontation, at the stroke of a British government pen?
Absolutely.
Okay. Síle, we are talking now, women are in lockdown, they've been restricted to the bathrooms, they're restricted in their movement. So was that the end of it, or did that wheel of repression turn even tighter?
No, that definitely wasn't the end of it. They then proceeded to block up the windows in the ground floor of A Wing. And
why? Just explain the reason for that.
it was to isolate us from the other prisoners. It was to isolate us from getting any information out. You see, on B Wing, because they were treating us as what some British Secretary of State called ordinary decent prisoners, we were on a wing with other prisoners. We were getting our visits, we were getting information in and out. You know, you were hearing the news because people were coming back, even the ordinary prisoners were coming back and telling you bits and pieces. But what they wanted to do was to confine the protesting prisoners to one section of the jail. It was almost as if they had us in one place, they could basically do what they wanted.
A special place.
Yes, yeah. So they moved everybody out of A Wing. There's a ground floor and an upper tier in A Wing. They moved everybody out. The male prison officers, prison guards, then were kind of billeted in the upper tier of A Wing. Now, they were constantly on that wing the whole time. The threat of being attacked by male prison guards was always there. We could hear them moving about, we could hear them chatting and laughing and all of that. They then moved us across the A Wing. They had blocked up all the cells, so there was no daylight. We had to break the windows to get air into the cells. They had control, the light switches were on the outside. They had control even of the lights. They locked us up then. We were locked up 23 hours a day. The only time we got out was to collect food or to slop out or to go for 1 hour's exercise because we still had our own clothes. So they then at the start were restricting us to 8 prisoners at a time. There was 32 of us. So there was 4 sessions of 8. They controlled the food, they controlled the time it came up to the hot plate. They would let the first 8 out before the food came up and then brought them back in, let another 8 out. The food was sitting on the hot plate, getting cold, becoming inedible. If for any reason, and we ourselves decided this, that it didn't suit us to have 8 in the prison yard, it suited us better to have 16 at a time, where Mairead Farrell could go out with one group and I could go out with the other. So we were instigating where they even blocked the spies so that you couldn't shout across the wing. So when somebody got out to go for exercise, they'd walk across the wing and open somebody's spy so that they could see out onto the wing or shout. And then you were attacked by the prison officers on the wing and dragged and thrown into the yard or back into your cell. If you were thrown back into your cell, that meant you didn't get any exercise. Control was what they wanted. They wanted us in that small number. They wanted to control every aspect of prison life. It was very intimidating. Because you have to understand, I mean, you're seeing me now at this age. At that age, I was only 21.
You haven't changed a bit.
I still look 21. But it was that, and for some people, it has to have had a psychological toll.
I want to return briefly just to the physical and mental toll that it did take on some of the women prisoners, but I want to bring Pádraig back, and he's been more than patient. It strikes me that if you're looking to and maybe Phil would want to comment on this, but if you're looking to administrate any prison, any large body of people who, for whatever reason, real or otherwise, you need to regulate that peaceful coexistence, that participation at whatever level is the key to it. But here we have a report that sets out from page 1 to the end that there was a conscious decision that the conditions that prevailed inside the prison would have more to do with what was going on in the politics outside than they were to administrate a well-oiled prison regime. Is that a fair assessment, or is that an exaggeration?
I think it is, because obviously there were prison rules at the time. There were standards, legal standards that had to be complied with by the prison authorities. There were human rights that the prisoners have. A lot of people forget that, okay, prisoners are deprived of their liberty, but they still have many of the fundamental freedoms and human rights that we all have when we're outside of prison. You know, the right to be free from torture and human degrading treatment, the right to proper health care, the right to family life, the right to proper diet. All of those were deprived, and there were multiple breaches of human rights. And as I mentioned earlier on, for me this was very politically motivated, and I think the very important part of the report is that is now evidence-based. That is evidence-based through the testimony of independent witnesses and through British government documentation. So once you had all these rules in place, you had these standards, legal standards, both domestic and international standards, they weren't complied with. And I think that's one of the lessons from the report, that we must prevent the recurrence of this, because a proper inquiry must be both restorative but also preventative. And I think that this has been an important process for these former prisoners to have their testimony heard, because as I think as Síle said at the outset, we're now 39 years on. The British government have failed in their obligation to investigate these very serious breaches of human rights. And it was up to the legal profession, NGOs such as Collusion, former prisoners and citizens to take this on board. And I hope that people can take some lessons from it.
I want to bring Phil in, and I want to put a scenario perhaps too. I remember vividly the conditions and the information, sometimes very limited but sometimes very graphic, that was coming out of both Armagh and of Long-Cash. I want to talk about the justification. So it ranged from hand-picked journalists talking about the food's delicious, walking down the wing and sampling the food, and it extended to, on a private basis, these are a few prison warders who are out of control, but they're being provoked. Yeah. Is there any other example of the systematic abuse of the numbers of prisoners in any jail that you've ever came into contact or any experience of?
Occasionally, and I've seen brutality directed against prisoners, but usually on a one-off basis or a small group. I can remember in Scotland walking into, the secure unit and seeing the list of names of the people in it. At the bottom it said Maggot 1, Maggot 2. And I said, who are they? And they said, oh, they're two prisoners who've assaulted prison guards. That kind of issue on a one-off basis, but nothing as systemic as this. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really listed here for a wider audience, I mean, people who are familiar with what happened in the jails here know this well. But right at the outset of the report, what I attempted to do was to demonstrate starkly the list of issues that we were seeing that were exceptional degradations. Mirror searches, whereby prisoners were held naked and spread-eagled over a mirror to look into their bodies. Intrusive body cavity searches across a table. Denial of access to necessary medical attention. Refusal to grant compassionate parole, legal representation at prison adjudication, use of toxic disinfectants and detergents in confined spaces, sleep deprivation caused by operating heavy compressors on the wings. Then the assaults, including drenching prisoners with fire hoses, cutting off heating in bitterly cold weather, assaults with scalding water, contaminating food and water with feces, urine, and maggots. These were acts of brutality that were constant, but they were also unpredictable. So they were constantly happening, but you didn't know when it was going to happen to you next, or to the prisoner in the next cell next. And of course, in the middle of all this is the regular beatings by guards using fists and boots and batons. So you get that image of total control, not over a short period of time, a week or 2 weeks, not as an act of retribution, but as an act that becomes institutionalized over years. And then you juxtapose that with the report of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland, and this was the importance, as Pádraig said, of getting access to the documents from Kew Gardens. There is no evidence that the physical or mental condition of the protesters is deteriorating as a result of their self-imposed routine. Doctor-patient relationships are normal. The protesters are provided with adequate food and they eat it. They are clean and free from infestation. They look healthy and are putting on weight rather than wasting away. And they're observed to sleep well. That is 2 years into the protest. So this juxtaposition of what we hear, the reality that is happening, that Síle so eloquently expressed in terms of what happened to the women on that one fateful day and continued afterwards, that is contrasted with this clean bill of health that's being given by a deputy medical officer here in the north. And that is what is fed back to Westminster.
And that contrasts starkly with, for instance, the comments of Cardinal Féile, who compares the blocks with the hellholes of Calcutta. Yes. I mean, so there is none so blind that those who choose not to see or to hear. I want to bring Séanna back in again, and then we'll return to Armagh. I suppose the title of this report speaks more to that sense of breaking prisoners, breaking their spirit, and on occasions breaking their bodies. So tell me how, or I don't know who came up with the title, but how did the title come about?
Well, the title comes from a story, an article that Bobby Sands wrote back in 1978, and it's actually quoted on the inside, and it talks about I am Sir, you are 1066, and the whole idea behind that was that the prison authorities, to do what they decided to do on other human beings, basically they had to dehumanize the prisoners in their own heads and in their own eyes. And this was one of the ways in which they did it, that they tried to strip us of our names. Everyone was to be seen as simply a number. And this, the very idea of it, that you're no longer, a person, that you're just a number. And that whole thing allowed them, to a large extent, to do what they did on a daily basis within the jails.
For those who are not, and Síle talked about these male prison warders, special designed clothes on the wings on a permanent basis. So the rat squads outside your door all the time. Doesn't matter what you do or don't do, they're there. The prison officers who, and we know some of the names, but the prison officers who were involved enthusiastically in the beatings or the isolation and all of that, would they have been a special group of prison officers, or were they the same people who you had consisted, or who you had surveyed with or worked with prior to this onslaught?
Well, to be fair, whenever they decided to do away with special category political status, they engaged in a whole recruiting campaign. The NIO, to recruit hundreds more prison warders, because as you can imagine, it takes a lot less prison guards to watch over your prisoner of war camp setup than it would whenever you bring it into the specially designed concrete H-blocks with the cells, the 25 cells in each wing, and so many prison guards per wing, so many prison guards per block, and all of the sort of gates and everything else that works along with that. So they went on a big recruiting campaign, and to a large extent, a lot of the guys who were recruited were former British military and former RUC guys, and also, it has to be said, members of loyalist organisations. They openly boasted about being members of the UDA or the UVF. They used to, on the 12th of July, they would get drunk and they would have an orange parade with their sashes on.
This is, just to get this clear, this is the prison authorities.
These are the prison guards within the wing. They would put on their orange sashes and march up and down the wing in an intoxicated state. And then invariably they would choose to attack one or two specific prisoners as part of their celebration.
Briefly, can I just add one point to that? One of the things that comes out very strongly in the evidence is how regularly prison officers or guards would come on duty under the influence of alcohol. In other words, they were drinking on site, as has gone on since, until very recently. There was a bar on site. They would come on duty drunk, come in on night time, and that was when the prisoners feared it the most, because they were drunk and random. So it's that toxic mix of the constant discrimination being applied with a vengeance once they had had drink inside them.
I want to return just again to Síle, and horrendous picture that you're painting up conditions inside Armagh Prison. And you mentioned that this was clearly taking a physical as well as a mental toll on women prisoners. Do you have examples of that? I know the book talks about some cases, but I mean, was the isolation something that could be seen or heard?
Well, I wouldn't mention anyone specifically, but I do know of at least one case where one of the young women actually had a nervous breakdown while she was in the prison. She didn't receive any medical attention. She didn't receive any help for the situation that she was in. There was a case where another young woman, obviously driven to distraction, tried to take her own life. You had cases of women who came in on remand who were pregnant and had their babies when they were in Armagh. And under prison rules, you're allowed to keep your baby with you for a year. And these women were told, you send the baby out. You either go to work or you send the baby out. So their children at a very young age, they had to take them down and hand them over to relatives in the visiting box. And so all of that, obviously, it has to have had, and I know the one woman in particular who did have a nervous breakdown at that time. We didn't know that until after we had met up after the prison, because we would still meet up with each other. There's also, if you look at the cases, 3 of these women who gave information, who gave their stories to the inquiry, have since died from cancer. 2 others had already died prior to the inquiry. Out of 32 women,
Out of
that's
32
5
women, 5
have
women
died
have died
as a
prematurely.
result of cancer, yes. There's also other cases that I know of some of the women who have survived, they're cancer survivors. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, even if you look at the women who were in before us with political status and women who were in Armagh jail after us and after I know of other cases of women who have died from cancer. And if you look at the numbers and you look at the rates of that, in my opinion, there has to be some kind of correlation between the prison itself, especially in terms of the protesting prisoners, with the stuff that was used to clean the cells and under the doors, and even the rates of asbestos in a 17th century prison. I think there has to be some correlation that just hasn't been looked at.
Can I just butt in again and add another point here? One of the most shocking elements of the Armagh prison testimonies was, and I know people don't like talking about this, but it's the obvious distinction between men and women, which is menstruation. And the appalling situation that women were expected to put up with in Armagh, not being able to have appropriate and proper access each month, not having sanitation, not having any kind of support in those circumstances was absolutely stark for me. And that makes a major distinction. And it's one that I think has to be taken into account. And one of the things that it became clear as we were doing the research, both on the blocks but also on Armagh, was that we had to have a section at the end of this report which considered the issues that Sheila's raised absolutely, which is the long-term consequences. Because while there have been deaths, and it is a disproportionate number of deaths, people are living in their families with these real memories, with these real pain. That will never go away. Yes, they've accommodated it. They've been incredibly brave in accommodating it, but it will never leave them. So it's not something that happened in the past. It's happening in your present, you know? And that's what I find difficult to extract from. It's like, oh yes, that happened in this period. It's so many years ago. But it's affected the lives of men and women, their children's lives ever since, however much they've tried to accommodate it. And that long-term consequence isn't just physical, from the cancer, etc. It's actually that psychological impact. I am absolutely shocked that so many men and women who came through this process are as strong as they are. And the report actually finishes with that quote, that for all I've been through, I'm still here, and I'm not going away, and I'm not changing, you know. And it's that issue that I think, it's that determination that also comes through the report. So the negatives are legion in the report, but that conclusion is the one real positive that, as Séanna said, has moved the whole debate on to a new dimension.
I want to bring Pádraig in for an opinion, and then we're going to start rounding off. I think we've nearly exhausted our time. One of the things that was a regular occurrence, and I have to say that there was little or no efforts made by the British authorities to disguise what was going on in the prisons. It was common knowledge. Visitors and others who had access to the prison were making reports or letting it be known on a regular basis. But the answer at every allegation was there is a system in the prison where those who feel aggrieved can make a complaint. Would you, having read the report, help to compile the report, having family members in the prison, dealing with human rights issue, and this is both maybe to Phil and you, was there ever going to be redress to prisoners by using the prison's complaint system?
I don't think prisoners had confidence in that process, and when you have a system with no confidence, you don't have participation. So many of these abuses, we've taken particular instructions from many former prisoners relating to this, didn't make those complaints because they felt they would go nowhere. Those who did, the complaints weren't followed up and certainly weren't investigated adequately. And that was one of the reasons for going down this road and for my initial advice is to question, because we felt that these issues were never investigated properly, were never ventilated, and were simply spoken between former prisoners. And that hadn't been properly looked at. So the state failed, and those prisoners didn't want to participate in a process ultimately was going to go nowhere. And I think it's very similar to my work in legacy. And if you look at inquests in the 70s, 80s, or judicial processes, many families decided not to participate. They had no confidence. And it's only in recent years when you've seen the arrival of the police ombudsman's office or certain structures that can accommodate an independent investigation that you've seen participation from people with the justice system, which was previously hostile. Unfortunately, the Good Friday Agreement didn't put in place an ombudsman, for example, who would look at the prisoner's experience, and you've had to fill that vacuum with an independent report like this. Now, one of the biggest concerns that I have, human rights abuses, and Phil knows this better than me, have always been a feature of prison life, and will for a long, long time, even despite this report. And you've seen in recent years that the use of torture and inhumane and degrading treatment is still a tool in British counterinsurgency strategy. We've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen that. We've seen some public inquiries, the Baha Musa. There have been many legal cases taken across the water in relation to that. And I think very importantly, what you've seen in relation to this issue of torture and inhumane and degrading treatment is increasing judicial activism. In the 70s, the judiciary didn't want to touch this. We've seen that. No confidence in it. But there has been an increase in judicial activism in recent years arising from those incidents reported in recent wars that involved the British. So I think there's probably more confidence today than there was 30 years ago or 40 years ago when this protest commenced. And this is something that prisoners, you talked about the unfinished business, may look towards what remedies may be there. Are there any legal redress for us? Obviously that is difficult given the time that's passed, but certainly I think there's more confidence now that this could be looked at in that justice process than it would have been at the time. And I suppose, go back to your point, if people don't have confidence and participate, I'm hoping now that we have an evidence base, we have an independent, and the key part of this panel, both that it was independent and it was international and it was evidence based. And I think these former protesting prisoners will have more confidence in terms of moving this forward.
Phil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that comes out in the report, there's a moment where in the blocks where two of the independent monitoring board, as they're now called, who are the prison monitors, they're taken from the community, they're not part of the prison system, and they're supposed to be entirely independent. And these two members of the board raise serious questions about issues that are going on inside. And the memorandum that is exchanged is that we're going to have to, basically putting it in a nutshell, these aren't the words, they're my words, but basically we're going to have to take them on one side and have a word with them. And that is exactly what happened. So in other words, even the so-called independent monitors who were supposed to be standing outside of the process were accommodated very carefully. I would imagine they were picked very carefully, but even when they had issues they wanted to raise, they were prohibited from raising it. And I think that's been one of the powerful issues about the report, is that we were able to uncover the detail of those issues. We can say that in popular, oh yeah, I suppose that person was squared off. But when you actually see it in writing that they were squared off, then you know absolutely what level of control was operating in the prison.
It has been an amazing, not least of all for those who suffered at the hands of it, but an amazing dark period. We're about to finish, and I would ask you all, just almost in a one-liner, where do we go with this report from here? So, Séanna, Síle, Pádraig, and yourself, Phil.
Well, for me, where we go is, first of all, we go to the families of the people who have died who were all of their stories are recorded in this, and the people who have endured and survived that whole prison struggle. That it's very important that these people are able to get a copy of the report, that they're able to find that affirmation within the report, and then it's up to us to get it out there far and wide internationally to help people understand what the British government policy did to the Republican prisoners in Armagh and the H-Blocks during this period.
Síle?
As the same as Séanna, I think it needs an international audience, but first and foremost, I think the families of those who were in the H-Blocks in Armagh need to see this report, because in some cases, I imagine it's very hard for families to try to understand why people are, even to this day, reacting the way they do to particular things. And I think this report is part of that beginning to understand, because when you talk to ex-prisoners, when we get together as ex-prisoners, we don't talk about being in the prison, we don't talk about the bad times and the hard times. We joke with each other and sort of hold each other up. But anyone who's never been in the prison doesn't understand. And I think this goes away to helping people to understand.
Pádraig?
I think the only weapon against bad history, which is used for political vindication, which happened in this case with the prison struggle, is scrupulous investigation of what is possible to know. We now have that, and I hope that the former protesting prisoners now feel empowered to take this where they want it. You know, whether it be through legal address, whether it be through just confirmation that their story's been heard and is accessible for future generations. That's a matter for them to take that forward.
Phil?
From my own point of view, it's so important that the histories, the lost histories of people that are known in their communities, known in their families, reaches the widest possible audience, because that, to a large extent, gives credibility where it was never given previously. That's so important. On a personal, academic level, as somebody who works in research, where we go from here is to underline the significance and importance of in-depth alternative accounts, so that we really do get to terms with the many brutalities that exist within our communities. So this is an exemplar case for me of how academic research can be married with community work, and together can bring about a process that takes us closer to the truth of the events. That is what critical research should do. And that's what certainly I would be dedicated to, whatever is the topic. But here, this is about an entire community across the 6 counties and beyond, actually.
Can I thank everyone for taking part in this? I found it very emotional. I'm sure you have as well. I want to commend those who solicited the report and those who compiled it and who edited it. And it wasn't just that, it was a very difficult job. And can I leave everyone with the thoughts of those prisoners who defended for us everything? I am a human being, I am not a number. Thank you.